As mentioned, I'll be giving the closing speech tomorrow on the subject of our conference, Catholics Against Anti-Semitism. But today I've been invited to speak about some of my work that looks at a different signature development of modernity, something that has become the invisible ink of most modern lives. That is the sexual revolution. In 2014, Franciscan University kindly invited me to talk about my then new book, Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. And I remember talking about it from this very spot. Earlier this year, the part 2, a second installment of that inquiry appeared as Adam and Eve After the Pill, revisited with a foreword by the late, great Cardinal Pell. So I would like to talk about the new book and the backstory to both. In my mind, this new book closes a body of work that I undertook from around 2008 to the present, a subject that's occupied a lot of my attention for the last 15 years. And in saying that the project is now closed, I don't mean the final word has been said, far from it. In fact, in a most welcome development that did not exist 10 years ago, it is now the case that new voices are emerging, including from non-religious orbits, that are newly skeptical of the post-1960s status quo. No, in saying that it's closed, I just mean that an idea that started percolating 15 years ago has now received the more or less systematic treatment that I first envisioned for it. The elevator version of that idea is simple. For 6 decades, a secularizing Western society has been telling itself a falsely happy story about the outcomes of the sexual revolution. To counter that false reading, we've needed an account of its fallout that is closer to the truth. And that account, I thought, should have 2 parts. One, examining post-revolutionary reality among individuals, and the other, examining its effects on the wider world. This unexpected adventure really began in 2008, when the editor of First Things, Jody Bottom, invited me to write an essay about Humanae Vitae to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the encyclical. At the time, this seemed like a fine opportunity for an exercise in spirited contrarianism, and so I signed on. After all, Humanae Vitae may be the most universally mocked and reviled religious statement of the past century. How on earth, millions and millions have asked, could the church possibly defend the teaching against artificial contraception? Didn't it want to get with the modern world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But in order to speak about Humanae Vitae, I first had to read the thing. And doing so for the first time floored me. Humanae Vitae makes several predictions about what the world would look like once the sexual revolution took hold. And the reason these predictions amazed me was simple, yet profound at the same time. As a researcher who had studied and written about various aspects of American society, I knew from various forms of evidence, popular as well as expert, that these predictions of Humanae Vitae were not just predictions. They had actually all come true. Sources abounded, especially in the social sciences, to prove it. In fact, Humanae Vitae was vindicated in ways that no other document I can think of has been vindicated, in ways that its authors could not possibly have foreseen, by information that did not exist when the document was written, and by scholars and other experts with no interest whatsoever in the Catholic Church. What struck me most forcefully here was that ancient moral teaching was being vindicated, inadvertently but roundly, by secular sources. It was not theology that was proving the downside of separating recreation and procreation, although no doubt theology can. Instead, it was scholarship about subjects like broken homes and interrupted relations between the sexes, and rising rates of mental illness and addiction, and a lot of other interrelated facts. And although, again, the myriad authors of that research across the decades wouldn't have dreamed of it, their work, understood in full, has gone to show, in effect, that ancient teaching had gotten something right. That perception, that aha moment, went on to result in the two Adam and Eve books and their contrarian readings of the legacy of the sexual revolution. The first book examined what might be called the microcosmic fallout of humanity's embrace of contraception, the effects on individual men, women, and children, and on the radically changed social mores of the post-revolutionary order. Then came the fallout from the first book, in particular, the emotional reaction of some readers. Adam and Eve After the Pill was neither intended nor executed as a volume of self-help. There was nothing personal about it. It made no sentimental appeals. Its arguments, though perhaps unorthodox now, were also unexcited. They were served up with cold utensils of data and logic. And although, like most authors, I had tried to avoid boring my readers into narcolepsy, I did not and do not believe that the book's prose accounted for the force of the reaction. Yet force there was. Evidence of its unexpected impact continued to accumulate not only in email, but in the rounds of real life. Often, following a book talk, individuals in the audience would linger and tell or write out their stories of blight, of families and children lost to the revolution's troika, divorce, pornography, abortion. A few snapshots. In response to one chapter, a man who had lived on the streets, prostituting himself, posted extraordinary commentaries online about how post-revolutionary permissiveness had nearly destroyed him. Another time, after a talk delivered in Texas, a woman approached to confide that this analysis had somehow encouraged her to have more children. Her friend affirmed that this was true, and they brought photos as proof. Following a speech in Ohio in a different year, a young woman came forward from the crowd to say that she'd driven a long way to deliver her message, that one of the chapters in that book had made her understand the pain she suffered as a child of sexual abuse, and how she had become a Christian after reckoning with that pain. What to make of these raw, unasked-for testimonials? Puzzling this out over the years, three conclusions took shape. The first and most obvious was that these stories amounted to affirmation of the book's thesis. The post-1960s disorder was indeed generating casualties of all kinds, and their suffering was not being noticed, let alone validated or addressed, by a secularizing culture steeped in denial. Also clear in hindsight, some readers were galvanized by a different current in the book, the idea that the sexual revolution was open for questioning at all. After all, since the 1960s, liberationists have anchored their successes to the supposed inevitability of history. The book's suggestion that these changes might not be permanent, that they could be subject, like other social phenomena, to scrutiny and revision, seemed to encourage some readers. A third conclusion also materialized in retrospect. Like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet, Adam and Eve After the Pill had wandered unknowingly into a wider drama. The book's contrarian case implicitly raised a question. If the secular consensus could whitewash the human damage out there in the name of progress, what else might it be missing? So this leads us to the new book, which is both a follow-on to the original and a new argument based on the last 10 years of work. It dissects the effects of the revolution on society, politics, and the church. This book, like the earlier one, revolves around the same general theme. Church teaching, including the most unpopular church teaching, is being vindicated inadvertently, but really by the accumulation of post-revolutionary evidence. So let's look quickly at one area covered in the book, the revolution's effects on society. Thanks to the compounding fractures of 6 decades, people today live very differently than our ancestors did. We live very differently than people across the planet throughout history. This is simple arithmetic. Families are smaller, families are broken. Many people no longer have siblings of the same sex or the opposite sex, or any siblings at all. Abortion continues, more and more kids grow up fatherless. In sum, post-revolutionary man has subtracted potential trusted souls out of his life on an unprecedented scale. This means a diminished pool of loved ones to count on. It means fewer people to trust and learn from. Rudimentary social learning is harder to come by. Post-revolution, the route to fulfillment and joy has become elusive. It must be laboriously rediscovered or reinvented by people who have been deprived, and the reinventions often don't work. Consider, we are surrounded by data suggesting that something about post-revolutionary life is inflicting widespread damage. Psychologists cite an unprecedented mental health crisis, especially among the young. Also at record levels, psychotropic meds for adults, licit and illicit. Across the United States, drug overdoses are higher than they have ever been, and life expectancy is declining for the first time in recorded history. Meanwhile, atomized broken children take to the streets in gangs or as solitary shooters, proving that loneliness fuels evil. Deaths of despair, a phrase that did not even exist back when the first Adam and Eve book was published, has entered the vernacular. This tragic recital points to causality. The sexual revolution is not the only force contributing to today's dysfunction, but it is the single most important cause of social decay that is not yet understood as such. The hope behind the new book and the old one is to change that misperception, to correct the record for the benefit of people present and to come. So let's look at a second area discussed in the book, how post-revolutionary trends are affecting our politics. The book argues that as the primal communities of faith and family have become more dysfunctional, more and more people have transferred their loyalties and attachments to other groups, in particular, groups based on identity politics or common bonds of ethnicity, race, erotic leanings, LGBTQ, etc. In other words, post-revolutionary change is at the root of identity politics. These political groups, I argue, operate as substitute families and substitute communities in a time when real ones have been debilitated in radical new ways. Note that this whole phenomenon of identity politics is born out of loss, out of the subtraction of people mentioned earlier. The third area covered in the book, which is the effects of the sexual revolution on Christianity itself. And you are getting the shortest possible version. As the last third of the book shows, the churches today are being torn apart because of this very question. Can Christianity jettison ancient teachings about marriage and sex without falling into decrepitude? Or can Christianity not? Christians are often accused of being obsessed with sex, but this was and is a bogus charge. It is exactly differences over sex that tear apart the churches today, not different interpretations of the Beatitudes or the saints or angels dancing on pins. Once more, can a Christianity that turns its back on 2,000 years of moral teaching succeed, or can it not? I believe the evidence of the collapse of the mainline churches speaks for itself, but readers should assess the evidence and judge. This brings us to one last point. We are all witnesses here and now to a great irony that encompasses not only the Christians of America, but those of the entire West. After all, Western Christianity spends most of its time these days in a defensive crouch, squabbling internally. Yet, all the while, evidence from outside the churches continues to point towards something that most people inside the churches seem not to know. Christianity, practically alone among all institutions, has been harboring profound truths for 2,000 years. Most notably, in this case, the truth that living by the big bad rule book is actually better for human beings than discarding it. To repeat, the irony is extraordinary. Even as the calls for capitulation grow louder, transforming and deforming discussion within the churches, the evidence thrown out by the world itself points in the opposite direction. Caving to the sexual revolution is what destroys Christianity. In sum, both Adam and Eve books make a contrarian argument. Post-revolutionary reality is other than what the dominant culture says it is. When the first book appeared 10 years ago, its argument was considered shocking outside religious circles. Today, it is gratifying to know more voices have joined that side of the argument, including secular voices, as the new book lists in several footnotes. Regardless of approval, both books were driven by humanitarian conviction. The revolution continues to claim many victims. To honor their witness is not some kind of reactionary indulgence. It's an attempt to give voice to the previously voiceless, and there needs to be more of that. It's my modest hope that the facts assembled in those books will persuade some believers and unbelievers alike, and most of all, give new heart to the wounded and those who tend them. Thank you.